What is up, everyone? It's Quinn here, and in today's video, I'm going to be going through my top 24 wide receiver rankings for the 2024 fantasy football season. I went through my top 24 running backs yesterday, so go check that one out if you haven't seen it already. But today, we're focusing in on the wide receiver position, splitting these guys up into tiers. Let me know your thoughts on these rankings down below. Which players do you have higher or lower than me? Would love to hear it. But let's just dive right into it, starting off with my wide receiver 1 in tier 1. It's going to be CeeDee Lamb. He was the wide receiver 1 in points per game and total points last year, averaged 23.7 PPR points per game, and really not much has changed here with his supporting cast. Still has Dak Prescott at quarterback. The Cowboys didn't go out and bring in another top weapon, so I think CeeDee Lamb is set up for another big-time year. Also still very young, so you're not really worried about him like falling off an age cliff or anything. Just a very strong wide receiver pick this year. Now, also in tier 1, my wide receiver 2 is going to be Tyreek Hill. He was right behind CeeDee Lamb last year in points per game, 23.5 PPR points per game. He was the wide receiver 2. And another guy who's in a very, very similar offensive situation. I guess the one concern here I do have with Tyreek Hill would be the age. He's 30. He's at some risk of slowing down. I'm not saying he's going to come out here, fall off a cliff. I still have him as my wide receiver 2, but I just think he has slightly more risk than CeeDee Lamb at this point in his career. And then my final tier 1 wide receiver is going to be Jamar Chase, my wide receiver 3. He honestly is coming off a pretty rough 2023 season, at least, for his standards. He was the wide receiver 12 in points per game, but it was pretty much just due to Joe Burrow's injuries. He was banged up early on in the season and then was out for the season, towards the end of it. I'm expecting a huge bounce back year. He was putting up amazing production in year 1, year 2. Year 3, deals with a tough situation. I think year 4 here for Jamar Chase is going to be a monster fantasy year. Now, pivoting out of tier 1 into tier 2, my wide receiver 4 is going to be Amon-Ra St. Brown. He averaged 20.7 PPR points per game last year, was the wide receiver 4, and it was just an all-around great season. He was top 5 in targets, target share, target rate, red zone targets, receptions, receiving yards, yak, and touchdowns. Another guy in a very similar offensive situation here in 2024, and a guy who's really built on each season year after year. He improved a ton from year 1 to year 2, took another jump from year 2 to year 3. I don't think we've seen like a peak season yet out of Amon-Ra St. Brown. And then my only other tier 2 wide receiver, it's going to be Justin Jefferson. Some people may think this is too low, and I get it, right? Just based on the talent, you could definitely make a strong argument that Justin Jefferson is the number 1 wide receiver in the NFL, but I just think he has a much sketchier offensive situation than the 4 guys ranked ahead of him. You're going from Kirk Cousins to either a rookie J.J. McCarthy or kind of an unproven Sam Darnold. He has averaged 19 plus PPR points per game in the last 3 seasons, so the past production has definitely been there. I just don't think he has a comparable ceiling to the guys ranked ahead of him, and specifically the guys ranked up in tier 1, just based on the offense he's in. Not his fault. Some guys have stud quarterbacks, others don't. And unfortunately, it's just kind of an unknown this year for Justin Jefferson. Now, getting out of tier 2 into tier 3, my wide receiver 6 is going to be Puka Nacua. He was actually the wide receiver 6 in points per game last year, which for a rookie is just pretty much unheard of fantasy production. I expect him to play a very similar role here in year 2 for the Rams. Even though Cooper Kupp was banged up last year, injured early on, injured throughout the season, Puka played so well, I don't think he's giving up that wide receiver 1 role back to Cooper Kupp. And he was the wide receiver 6 in points per game and only scored 6 touchdowns. I think we could see that number increase, and then he's really giving you a huge, fantasy ceiling, potentially 20 plus PPR points per game. I do think that's in the cards here for Puka Nacua. Continuing on with tier 3, my wide receiver 7 is going to be Garrett Wilson. He's a guy who has been very impressive through his first 2 seasons, especially when you consider the offensive situations he's been in. 1,000 plus receiving yards in both seasons, and that was with horrible quarterback play. He's going from Zach Wilson, Tim Boyle, Trevor Siemian, to now Aaron Rodgers back at the quarterback position. I mean, that's about as big of an upgrade as you're going to find, at least, specifically for this season. And I do think this is the time where we should be getting that Garrett Wilson wide receiver 1 season. It feels like it was postponed a year because of the Aaron Rodgers Achilles, but if Rodgers is healthy and ready to go, I think this is the time here for Garrett Wilson. And then my final tier 3 wide receiver is going to be A.J. Brown, and I think he's kind of the last player here before we have a pretty significant tier break into tier 4 and tier 5. A.J. Brown has been the wide receiver 8 in points per game in back-to-back seasons. He's actually coming off career highs in both targets and receptions, so he saw some increased volume in the 2023 season. One, I guess, potential concern here for A.J. Brown would be that he has not yet cracked an 18 PPR point per game season, so he hasn't necessarily given you like that nuclear upside, but I think that could be in the cards this year. We saw the volume increase, like I mentioned, in 2023. If he can combine that volume with the efficiency he's had in his first 4 NFL seasons, I think that's where we get to see the upside out of A.J. Brown. Does it happen? I don't know, but even drafting him here as like the wide receiver 8, if he's still in like that 17 plus PPR point per game range, I think you're still, feeling good about drafting him here. Like I mentioned, pretty massive tier break going from A.J. Brown, my wide receiver 8, to the rest of these wide receivers. Starting off my tier 4, it's going to be Marvin Harrison Jr., and I'll admit it's pretty unheard of for a rookie to be ranked or drafted this high. I personally have, never ranked a rookie wide receiver this high in my pre-draft rankings, but it's just kind of the perfect storm of like Marvin Harrison Jr. being a top prospect, getting a really solid landing spot, and then there's also just not a ton of like back-end wide receiver 1s, high-end wide receiver 2s that I feel like have a ton of realistic upside. So it's just the combo of, he's a great player in a great situation, and then it's just kind of the landscape at wide receiver this year. We've also seen, recent rookies, guys like Puka, Tank Dell, Jamar Chase, Justin Jefferson. They've all made it seem a little bit more palatable to kind of be reaching on these rookies early on in drafts because there is, a ceiling that's out there for these guys in year 1, especially if they're going to the right situations, right? Justin Jefferson paired with Kirk Cousins, Jamar Chase paired with Joe Burrow, Tank Dell with C.J. Stroud, Puka Nacua, Matthew Stafford. Marvin Harrison Jr. is not an early round pick going to like a Garrett Wilson situation, a Chris Olave situation, a Drake London situation. He's going to be paired with Kyler Murray, which I think is going to be huge for fantasy for him. So he will lead tier 4 for me. And then behind him, we're going with Drake London here, my wide receiver 10. And kind of similar to Garrett Wilson, he's had some solid production in his first 2 seasons, but he hasn't necessarily had the quarterback play. He's getting a massive quarterback upgrade this year, going from like Ritter/Heineke to now Kirk Cousins coming in. I do understand that like expecting or projecting Drake London to jump from wide receiver 42 and wide receiver 43 in points per game to now a top 10 wide receiver does seem a little bit extreme. Like if you have Drake London lower, I get it. It does seem like a big jump, but I just feel like in this range of wide receivers, you have some dudes in this area that are kind of proven. You know what you're going to get out of them, and maybe you just don't see the big upside, with where they're being drafted right now. In this spot, I'm fine taking a swing on like a more unknown wide receiver who I do believe is talented, going to a strong situation. So is he the safest pick here as like the wide receiver 10? No, but I think the upside could be worth it. And I do just think talented player, getting a quarterback upgrade, good things should happen this year for Drake London. Now continuing on with tier 4, I actually have back-to-back 49ers wide receivers. The first one is going to be Brandon Ayuk. He was the wide receiver 16 in points per game last year. Was also very efficient last season, second in yards per target, yards per reception, and yards per team pass attempt. One thing I will point out is like, it's not necessarily great, right, if he was like a high-end wide receiver 2 while also being incredibly efficient. Like, is he going to repeat that here in 2024? But the 49ers stayed very, very healthy last season, and I do think injuries to, the top weapons in this offense really kind of unlock the ceiling for the other guys. So if Ayuk were to go down, I think Debo's ceiling increases. I think Kittle's ceiling increases. We just really didn't get any of that last year. Like, I'm not expecting all these dudes to stay healthy over the entire season. So I do think, there's some potential upside there. But he is going to be competing for touches with CMC, Debo, Kittle. There's a lot of studs in this room. So if those guys aren't going down, they're not missing games, and they're at full force every week, then he's probably not paying off here as the wide receiver 11. And then for Debo, he was the wide receiver 13 in points per game last year. And it's kind of a similar argument to the one I made with Brandon Ayuk. I think Debo's also interesting because he kind of has like this rare handcuffed running back value, which you don't see at the running back position. Like if CMC were to go down, you get Debo stepping in there, taking more carries, some red zone looks. He definitely gets a bump. So I think there are definitely avenues for Brandon Ayuk and Debo Samuel to be wide receiver 1s. And even if there's not a ton of injuries, they're giving you the normal production, they're still high-end wide receiver 2s, and you're not taking a huge loss with where you're picking them. Continuing on with tier 4, we have Chris Olave. And I do have some real questions about Olave's ceiling within the Saints offense, but he's been impressive through 2 seasons. Wide receiver 25 in points per game as a rookie, wide receiver 19 in year 2. I'm fine with taking a swing on like a young, talented rookie. Even in a poor situation, you probably expect him to improve in the touchdown department. He has 9 total touchdowns through 2 seasons, should continue to get better. Mid-tier wide receiver 2 last year. Not crazy to think he takes the jump to like fringe wide receiver 1 production. And then after Chris Olave, we have Davante Adams, kind of like an opposite end of the spectrum here in terms of age, where they're at in their career. And I feel like picking Davante Adams here could either turn into a home run or could just end up being a complete disaster. Adams racked up a ton of volume last year. He was second in targets, target share, target rate, red zone targets. He was getting a lot of looks within this Raiders offense. He was also first in air yard share, but he only ended up being the wide receiver 15 in points per game. So, like, are we seeing him start to fall off? Was it just an unlucky year? Obviously, the quarterback play wasn't great, but it's probably not going to be much better this season. You also have Brock Bowers coming in as target competition. So I think we're just in this interesting spot here with Davante Adams where we could definitely see him have a bounce back, especially if he's just as involved as he was last season. But we're also, maybe seeing him start to slip a little bit. We could end up seeing him put together a similar or maybe even worse season, if that decline is there. Then my final tier 4 wide receiver is going to be Nico Collins, coming off a massive year 3 breakout. He was the wide receiver 7 in points per game last year. He definitely has some legit target competition this year with Tank Dell and then Stephon Diggs being added. But I do think if I was choosing between these 3 Texans wide receivers, Nico Collins is probably the guy I would go to. Him and Tank Dell were very comparable in their production when they were both on the field together, but he's not coming off the injuries. Just signed a pretty big extension. I think it's fair to have Nico Collins here as the top option from that Texans wide receiver room. Now pivoting into tier 5, we're going to start off with a guy who's also in a pretty crowded wide receiver room, and it's DJ Moore. You have Keenan Allen, Rome Odunze, both those dudes were added this offseason. He is getting a quarterback upgrade with Caleb Williams, and he's coming off his best fantasy season of his career, was the wide receiver 9 in points per game. Another guy here where I'm just not quite sure what the ceiling is within this current Bears offense. Like, is he going to be a top 10 guy now that you're adding in Keenan Allen, adding in Rome Odunze? I don't think it's crazy. Like, there are avenues where Keenan Allen getting up there in age, injuries have been a factor over the last couple of seasons. Maybe he's taking a step back. Maybe Rome Odunze doesn't step in and ball out from day one, and you're getting like DJ Moore, clear wide receiver 1 for Caleb Williams, who's playing well. So there are routes for, him to have that ceiling, but in terms of, the percentage of that happening, I'm not super sure. I think it's fair to, have him here as like a mid-tier wide receiver 2 option. I feel like that's probably where he'll end up falling in most drafts. Continuing on with tier 5, we have another Texans wide receiver, but it's actually going to be Tank Dell. I think a lot of people have Stephon Diggs ranked as the second Texans wide receiver. For me, I'm going with Tank, and I feel pretty decent about it. There were 7 games last season where Tank Dell and Nico Collins played together, and both had over a 50% snap share. In those games, Tank Dell averaged 18.8 PPR points per game, and Nico Collins averaged 18.2. So they were very, very close together. Tank Dell actually had the slight edge in those matchups where they were playing together. He's coming off the broken fibula. Was also shot this offseason, but reports are that he's healthy heading into the 2024 season. He's currently being drafted as the wide receiver 26 on Underdog, and I just really can't fathom how someone who was so good and so productive as a rookie is now being drafted as like a wide receiver 3. Like, if he had that production over the entire season, he is a locked-in wide receiver 1 over the full year. Obviously, that's an if. It didn't happen. It was a 7-game sample size. But he was wildly productive, and now you're able to draft that dude heading into his second season as a wide receiver 3. I feel like he's a no-brainer pick at his current price. I know the addition of Stephon Diggs definitely kind of clouds this wide receiver room, but I feel like if you're looking at this Texans offense, they should be running 3 wide receiver sets at a very, very high rate. I feel like there are a lot of people out there who think that Tank Dell is just going to be knocked out of 2 wide receiver sets. He's going to be like locked in the slot, only getting in there on those 3 wide receiver sets. And could that happen? Sure. But I definitely don't think it's a guarantee. And I feel like Tank Dell gets this rep as like, oh, he's a slot guy. He's going to play the slot because he's pretty tiny, and he definitely is small, but he only played 22% of his snaps out of the slot last season. He was playing out wide. Stephon Diggs was actually up at 30%, so he played, a higher percentage of his snaps out of the slot. Not saying that Tank Dell won't do it with this new look wide receiver room, but I just don't think there's any guarantee that like Tank Dell is the odd man out here, and I'd actually pick him to finish as the wide receiver 2 in this room. Continuing on at the wide receiver position, Jalen Waddle here is my wide receiver 18. a guy who's been pretty consistent through his first 3 seasons. 15.4, 15.3, and 14.2 PPR points per game. He's just a really solid wide receiver 2 option, and I do think he has some upside we haven't seen yet if Tyreek Hill were to go down. Like if Tyreek Hill gets injured, I mentioned the age, maybe the durability slips a little bit. Jalen Waddle probably would be a weekly wide receiver 1, potential like mid to high end wide receiver 1, stepping into like all those touches that Tyreek Hill's getting. So definitely someone who I'd be willing to pick here as like a mid-tier wide receiver 2. Then at wide receiver 19, going with Michael Pittman. He's been a wide receiver 2 in points per game over the past 3 seasons. He averaged 15.6 PPR points per game last year, was the wide receiver 14, the best fantasy season of his career. He did that while only scoring 4 touchdowns, which was 43rd in the NFL, but he was 9th in red zone targets. So he's top 10 in getting targeted in the red zone, but is scoring outside the top 40 in terms of touchdowns at the wide receiver position. That tells me that number should probably improve, the touchdown number, in 2024. He was also 4th in target share, 4th in receptions. There is a change-up in quarterback, right? Most of last year was with Gardner Minshew. Now you have Anthony Richardson coming in. You have A.D. Mitchell added to this wide receiver room, but I still think Michael Pittman's a nice mid-tier wide receiver 2 play. He's clearly talented. I'm high on this Colts offense, and we saw Shane Steichen. They were setting stuff up for him. They wanted to have him heavily targeted last year. I think that carries into the 2024 season. Next up is going to be Mike Evans, and I can already feel people hating this ranking here with Mike Evans down here at wide receiver 20. But just hear me out. This is something I've talked about in a few different videos here. I think we can all agree that Mike Evans produced much better than most people expected last season. There was the uncertainty. Brady was gone. You had Baker Mayfield coming in. We didn't even know if Baker was going to be the starting quarterback, right? It was like a quarterback controversy between him and Kyle Trask. So there was not a ton of confidence with this Bucs wide receiver room. Evans and Chris Godwin were being drafted pretty close together and not, highly drafted. They were not being drafted as like wide receiver 2s. They were probably like back-end wide receiver 3s last year. But Evans outproduced what I think most people expected. Wide receiver 10 in points per game. But I just don't think that separation between him and Godwin is going to continue into this season. 2023 was the biggest point per game rank disparity between him and Godwin since 2018. Looking back at the last 4 seasons, before 2023. 2019, Evans was the wide receiver 5 in points per game. Godwin was wide receiver 2. 2020, Evans was wide receiver 16. Godwin was wide receiver 15. 2021, Evans wide receiver 10. Godwin wide receiver 7. 2022, Evans wide receiver 13. Godwin wide receiver 15. So Godwin was actually the higher scoring wide receiver in 3 of those 4 seasons. The big change in 2023 was that Godwin was moved out of the slot. From 2019 to 2022, he played at least 50% of his snaps from the slot. In 2023, that fell to 24%. So he went from playing over half the snaps out of the slot to now less than a quarter of them there. Offensive coordinator Dave Canales is gone, now with the Panthers. The new offensive coordinator has come in. He's already talked about moving Chris Godwin back into that slot role. And I just expect Mike Evans and Chris Godwin's fantasy production to be much more aligned this season. I think in certain platforms, Mike Evans is going to be overdrafted. I think pretty much everywhere, Chris Godwin is going to be underdrafted. And I do just think they're going to come together this season much closer than what we saw last year, which is why I'm going to be a little bit lower on Mike Evans than consensus. The next wide receiver 21, is going to be Malik Nabers. And there's no doubt that he was not drafted to the best landing spot, but Nabers is truly an elite wide receiver prospect. He is by far the best wide receiver that Brian Daboll's had to work with here with the Giants. I could see Malik Nabers having like a Jalen Waddle-esque rookie season where he's a guy who has big playability, but maybe ends up getting relied upon more for like volume in year 1, which is what we saw with Jalen Waddle right before Mike McDaniel got there. Ton of targets. Didn't have a ton of breakaway plays, but he was getting force-fed because he was the clear top weapon. I think we could see that out of Malik Nabers. I want to say I'm like a little bit higher on this Giants offense than most. I feel like most people just view this entire team as a dumpster fire. But in 2022, this is a team that made the playoffs. I believe in Daboll as an offensive mind. As long as the offensive line can do anything and Daniel Jones, can try to stay healthy, or even Drew Lock, honestly, I think Nabers is an interesting option as like a back-end wide receiver too. And I'm guessing on like Yahoo, ESPN, you're probably going to be able to get him, probably significantly later than that, if I had to guess. Continuing on here, I have Stephon Diggs as my wide receiver 22. Like I mentioned, I think most people have him as the number 2 Texans wide receiver. For me, he's my number 3. I think he had a pretty interesting 2023 season to break down. He finished as the wide receiver 13 in points per game, which maybe, that wasn't the production you drafted him for. I think he was going as like a mid-tier wide receiver 1 last year. But it was really a story of two halves. If you had him in the first half of the season, you would have thought it was a smash pick. A great job by you when you're up on the clock. Through the first 9 games, he was averaging 21.7 PPR points per game. In his last 8 games, he didn't even hit double digits. He was at 9.8 PPR points per game. A fall off that steep, at least in my opinion, should be alarming, especially for a wide receiver who will turn 31 during this season. He's getting up there in age. If this was like a younger wide receiver, maybe just chop it up to bad luck, and maybe it was bad luck for Stephon Diggs. He just front-loaded his production. On the whole, the season wasn't that bad, fringe wide receiver 1 production, but I do think some alarm bells probably should be going off here with Stephon Diggs. He's also joining the Texans. He doesn't have that built-in chemistry like Tank Dell and Nico Collins have, so that's why I'm going to be a little bit lower than consensus when it comes to Stephon Diggs. Could he end up being great? Sure, but I do think you're taking on a little bit of risk just based on the fall off he had last season, and also some serious target competition here with Tank Dell and Nico Collins. Now, my wide receiver 23 is going to be Cooper Kupp. He was the wide receiver 1 in points per game in 2021 and 2022. He fell down to actually the wide receiver 23 last year, and injuries definitely played a significant role. But I also think the introduction of Puka Nacua was also a massive factor, right? Over the last few seasons, the Rams were so reliant on Cooper Kupp to be their clear-cut wide receiver 1, and they really didn't need to ask him to be that, for them last year with the introduction of Puka as a rookie. In 2021, Cooper Kupp was 1st in target share, 5th in target rate. In 2022, he was 3rd in target share, 4th in target rate. In 2023, he fell to 16th in target share and 17th in target rate. He also wasn't getting a lot of like the easy gimme targets that he got in 21 and 2022. Those were going to Puka. He went from catching 76 and 77% of his targets in 2021 and 2022 to only 62% last year. I still think Cooper Kupp's going to be productive, but I'm not one of these guys who's like expecting him to take back the wide receiver 1 role. He's getting up there in age a little bit. Puka Nacua is obviously a stud. I think he's going to hold on to that wide receiver 1 role. If Cooper Kupp is healthy, I think he could definitely produce better than he did last year, but you're also taking on the risk with his age. The injury history we saw last season, there's definitely some risk involved, but as a back-end wide receiver 2, I think it makes sense. And then the final wide receiver in these rankings, this could have gone to a few different guys. I went with Devonta Smith. He was the wide receiver 14 in points per game in 2022, was the wide receiver 20 last year, and I think if I had to make a bet, I do think he's going to finish better than the wide receiver 24, but I just don't think he has the ceiling of some of the players ranked ahead of him. Without an injury to A.J. Brown, he's just very firmly locked in as the number 2 weapon here. Now, if Brown were to go down, maybe Devonta Smith has that wide receiver 1 upside. But with A.J. Brown healthy, I just don't see it. I think A.J. Brown's a clear-cut top option. So I still think he's a really nice fantasy wide receiver 2. A very safe pick, but I just don't know if he has the upside of some of the guys ahead of him. But that is going to wrap it up for my top 24. Let me know your thoughts. Which players are you higher on, lower on? Would love to hear your reasoning. Thank you all again, and I will see you in the next one.